Good evening. My name is KIRILL Gerstein, and you've tuned into KIRILL Gerstein Invites, an online seminar hosted at the Hanns Eisler Musik Hochschule. We're in virtual space, and it's a particular and a special thrill to welcome Gary Burton, the legendary jazz vibraphonist, educator, composer, incredible musician, incredible person, to welcome him here today. I'm fortunate to have also a very personal feeling towards Gary, because I literally wouldn't be here or anywhere without him, because I initially came to America to study jazz at his invitation, and we've stayed in touch throughout the years. So he's a dear friend, a mentor, and an incredible musician, as you all know, and one of the greatest improvisers in the world. And he'll talk to us about improvisation in jazz. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. Your questions are very expected and invited, and I'll try to pass them on at the right time in our discussion. And now, welcome, Gary. It's great to see you. Great to have you here.
I'm very honored to be here, KIRILL. I've watched the announcements of your series of interviews over the last months or so, and it's a great company to be in. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for agreeing. So improvisation in jazz, and just to lead off, I think I told you this this anecdote. I remember being in your office at 8:30 in the morning on the 6th floor of Berkeley on Boston Street, and you being as awake as ever, and explaining what was happening as you were improvising a solo, which was a feat of simultaneous verbal and muscular control. But also, I think you started off by saying, well, improvisation is not really just using prefabricated blocks and licks and sticking them in, but what interests you in improvisation is really motivic development. So I thought to start off asking you some general questions about improvisation, how you think about it, and then letting you lead this off.
Sure. Well, that's one of my preaching issues all through my career as a teacher, was to try to explain and encourage people to improvise based on developing a storyline, so that, and to try to avoid using familiar cliche phrases. And I used to give different examples. I mean, for instance, if I study a foreign language, which I've done a couple of times in my life, you end up at the beginning with a collection of familiar phrases. You know, what time is lunch? Where's the train station? And so on. And if I'm sitting in a Paris cafe and I say a couple of those sentences, somebody walking by may say, "Oh, he speaks French." But the truth is, I don't speak French. I couldn't tell a joke. I couldn't discuss philosophy or politics, or anything that's more complex and personal and expressive. And as musicians, it always disappoints me when I hear a player play and it's one familiar jazz phrase after another with no actual connection between them. They sound familiar and friendly, nothing wrong with that. In fact, some of the most successful jazz musicians along the history of the music played this way. They essentially played familiar phrases and played them extremely well. And 99% of the people listening enjoyed it immensely. And even I said, well, yeah, actually, it's enjoyable listening to them. But there's no storyline being developed. So the players that really got my attention were the ones who knew how to start a solo, with a phrase and see where it takes you, what comes next, where it goes next. And so my early inspirations for that, Bill Evans was certainly one. When I was in my late teens, Miles Davis was terrific at this. He could tell a story in the fewest notes and leave big pauses between phrases, which just amazed me. What kind of courage that takes. You really have to believe in the little phrase you just played if you're going to wait 10 or 15 seconds before you play the next little piece of melody. And he was, impressive with this. And that's where that phrase, less is more comes from. It took me the first half of my career to try to play less. It was always too easy. I had technique came easy to me, and everybody I know that's had an easy time of it with technique says the same thing. Yes, it's a struggle to hold back, to select what you're going to play and not overdo it. And so maybe now is the time I should comment on Chegue de Saudade, the piece that you opened with. That piece, it got recorded once at a live concert for a record in 1971, which even it was too fast. And when I hear it, it embarrasses me. But there were also many live performances like the one we saw, which I could tell by the fringe jacket I was wearing had to be in the early 70s. But the more I played that piece, the faster it got. It was more increasingly comfortable, and there were no other musicians to kind of hold me at a more, regular tempo. And now when I listen to it, 50 years later, I'm, say, oh my God, what was I thinking? It's all the beauty, all the beautiful melodies of this piece that I so admired when João Gilberto first sang it, when I played with Stan Getz. And I said, yeah, this is a song I want to learn. I feel like I totally, butchered it when I actually got to the point where it became one of my featured pieces. So it's been kind of an irony to me over the years that this is one that certainly all the vibraphone players tend to talk about and ask me, can they get the music to it and so on. And I sort of shudder a little bit and don't say anything about it.
Well, to my innocent ear, it's brilliant, but it's an interesting point, and we immediately delve and depart from the topic of improvisation. But what you were just saying, as we tested our connection, that you observed it with a number of players, with yourself, yes, with others, that things upon repetitions got quicker. I think you cited Bill Evans as one. It would be interesting to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, well, I was a huge Bill Evans fan in my early years. He was definitely a departure from the typical improviser and jazz soloist of that era. And the way he played the piano was so much more pianistic than percussive. And I understand why earlier jazz pianos were more percussive. You could hardly ever hear the piano in early jazz ensembles because microphones were not very good, and the pianist was always kind of pounding it back there to keep up with the other instruments. But Bill came along and played with a lighter touch and much more range of colors and use of dynamics in his phrasing. And he had this knack of developing melodic themes that caught my ear. And so I followed his music quite closely for the first decade of my career. And I began to notice, when I would go into a club to hear Bill play, that the pieces were getting faster and faster, the ones that he played regularly as part of his standard repertoire. And I wondered about that, but I guess that's, you know, it's maybe part of our instinct is we need to keep making the piece exciting and more exciting. And one way of doing that is to play it a little faster, a little brighter. And the other person that I noticed did this over the years was Miles Davis, who again stuck with some pieces for years at a time in his repertoire. And then I would hear it a few years later and I would say, wow, you know, compared to the record when it was about half this speed, he's now just racing through it. And so I think there's, you know, in jazz, especially because of the time feel going on, there's part of our goal is to, you know, create energy and, you know, strong pulse and so on. And maybe that's not always as much of a factor in classical music. I wouldn't know. But certainly in jazz, I notice it tends to happen. And I've sometimes actually taken a song out of my repertoire for a while and purposely came up with a new arrangement to start it, you know, back at a more, you know, modest, mellow tempo, because I feel like it's getting, you know, too rushed, I guess would be the word we would use.
Did you experience the opposite in yourself and with other jazzmen that you observed, that some pieces in your repertoire got slower and slower, or you find the tendency is more one way?
I think it's more one way. I mean, I used to love a lot playing ballads because it's a whole different mindset. You know, it's not about the energy. It's about the, you know, this spaciousness and the beauty and staying in the mood of the piece, you know, from start to finish. That was always my goal, was to, like an actor, to, you know, not get out of character for the entire run of the piece. And that's the challenge with ballads. You know, you got to be careful not to throw in an extra phrase just because you can. You have to think, you know, what needs to be here, what needs to come next. And if you don't feel a clear picture of what needs to come next, then you wait.
So I want to get back to, you said so a solo, an improvised solo, this is telling a story, which makes sense and is often also used in discussions and classical music, so-called classical music teaching, but the devil being in some way in the translation. So what constitutes telling a story? What do you refer to when you say, well, the solo should tell a story, or this solo is telling a story, versus one that is not?
Right. Well, I think in terms of, you know, there are these people who are really naturals at storytelling in language. They become often famous as actors or speakers and so on. And they have a knack of being able to tell the story and never, you know, divert from the storyline and lose the focus of it all. And they have a way of telling the story in an interesting pace and flow and style of talking. And I think that's what works in the ideal improvised solo. We stay in the character of the song, and we try not to divert from what, you know, as the melodic theme, you know, gets varied and follows its path. We resist the temptation to throw in a cliche phrase just to fill some space. Every time I catch myself doing that, I would say, you know, I did it again, you know, stop doing that. And by that time I was, let's say, in my 30s. I'd been already performing and touring and recording for at least, 10, 15 years by the point where I was able to see as I was doing it, where I was going wrong, and or sensing when I was about to, lose the thread, and push myself to stay focused. It's one of the hardest things to learn and develop, and nobody comes by it, I think, instantaneously, like some gift of and so on. It's for me anyway, it was a slow, steady evolution of my storytelling ability. It was through music instead of through speech, but that's what was happening. And by the time I was 50, I was pretty confident that I could stay in character almost like 90% of the time in the course of a concert, that I could depend on each solo being right where I wanted it to be. But then, that had taken me 30 years to get there.
Good things take some time. I remember actually you once saying to me that you would liken jazz improvising to a stand-up comedian, where you sort of have a basic idea of what jokes and what gags are to be included in a particular piece, but at the same time, you're obviously not learning the routine word by word.
That's right. In fact, I've used that analogy a lot because you watch a comedian, especially the ones that tell stories as opposed to one-liners, like single statements that are funny and then they string them together. But the comedian that tells longer stories, George Carlin, Jerry Seinfeld come to mind, for instance, they're reading the audience. They're about how long to pause between phrases, how to, and they will, rearrange. They won't use the exact same words on every performance. They'll let the actual sentences, be more spontaneous and slightly different, even though, as you say, the point of the story stays the same, and it's something that you already know you're going to talk about and what your feelings are about it, and that's to me what it feels like when I'm soloing on a piece. Each piece to me is like a part in a play, and my job is to find my character and bring it to life and stay with it during the performance of that particular work. It's like a little actor's vignette, doing different characters on the course of the performance, and I can usually tell when I'm really locked into it. There's a certain, this feels great, and it's so clear where I'm going with this, and so on. When it's one of those nights when everything seems to really work, it's the greatest feeling. That's why you go through all the hassle of the airplane trips and the hotel rooms and everything else.
Mm-hmm. There's really a question from David Soiser, if I pronounced the last name correctly. I hope I do. I apologize if I don't. And it links to a question of mine, but his question is, what is the best / a good way to practice this quote unquote storytelling way of soloing? And if I could add my question to this one, is to also ask you said, so in your development, it took you a long while, but what were the helpful aids in developing? Was it listening to your own recordings, playback, or feedback from colleagues, or just the general osmosis? But I links to David's question. What is the best or good way to practice these?
Okay, well, you hit on some aspects of how to approach it. The first thing is to choose a song that offers inspiration, whose melody or harmony structure offers a lot of, opportunity. It plays itself. I used to say that sometimes about some of Chick Corea's songs, that when I would learn them, it was like I didn't have to make much effort at all. The tune itself, Crystal Silence, which became one of my favorites of the first pieces we ever learned together. If all I had to do was just sort of play the melody, and I was in character. I felt this song. So choose, and I can tell you, it's harder to improvise on a song that doesn't have much meat to it. Pick a song where the composer is already giving you a helping hand by giving you interesting harmony progressions and melody phrases from which to draw your, excuse me. My dentist just tried to call me. Let's see where I was at. Yes.
Hopefully this is not as excruciating as dentists usually.
Pick good songs that really you feel connected to and relate to, and then start with introduce a melody phrase in the first measure, and see how long you can stay with it, repeating it and making little variations. At first, one approach I've told students is start out just playing the written melody, and then try to gradually stray from it, but still use it as a guide, embellish on it. And because if you're working with a great song to begin with, you're already going to sound good. In fact, a lot of Stan Getz's his favorite solos for me, when he would take the melody of a ballad and just change it a little bit, and you wouldn't realize that that he was essentially just playing off the melody. It just sounded like he was soloing, but it really was great melody, great everything. And in that era, for me, I had to make every solo had to be completely new. I wouldn't dare play any phrase of the original melody. That would be cheating. But I heard him being so good at this. I said, okay, I'm missing out here. I need to use these melodies more. They're right there for the taking. So that's my second piece of advice. Develop using the original melody as a starting point, and the thing of introduce a theme, and then try to see how long you can keep that theme going. Can you repeat it and vary it only for 2 bars or 4 bars or 8 bars? When you can play an entire 32 bars of the song using the same melodic theme, you're well on your way to being able to do this.
There's two questions that also are related. One from conductor Donato Cabrera, and one from somebody I think you know very well, from Vadim Nisilovsky.
Oh yeah,
who's also here, which is very nice.
Yeah,
so Vadim's question is: your phrases are always so distinct and easy to recognize. Could you please talk about developing your personal recognizable language as an improviser? But this links to the question that Donato asked earlier, which is saying, like learning a language, does Gary acknowledge that in learning improvisation, a young person should learn as many of the cliche phrases as possible, if nothing else, to eventually forget them all in the process of discovering a unique voice? So cliches versus not cliches. And
good questions. I'll start with the second one. I've always pointed people to don't get too trapped in the cliche trap, or you may not get out. That may be where you'll end up. So while it makes sense at first, and I'm sure I used a certain number of first phrases that I learned, first jazz licks, as we say in the beginning, I had one advantage. In my case, I played the vibraphone, which very few people did. And my main influence was the player I respected the most was Milt Jackson, and I didn't have a sense of wanting to sound like him. For some reason, I heard a different way of playing. I was influenced by piano players and horn players, and while Milt I enjoyed listening to, it never occurred to me to try to actually copy his, actual phrases. And so in a way, I was drawn into finding my own voice earlier than many players. And particularly, I used to feel sorry for the tenor sax players, for instance, back in my youth. I mean, Coltrane was such a dominant inspiration that it had to be difficult for tenor sax players to, not get caught up in, being another clone of Coltrane. And it was a challenge for piano players because of Bill Evans. I remember Keith Jarrett, wanting to, be careful not to fall into following in Bill's, footsteps, but to find his own inspirations. One thing I advise is don't find one player that you then end up being a copy of. If you're going to borrow from people, borrow from quite a few, and include a few obscure players in there as well. Now, what did Dina ask?
Vadim's question was about developing your unique style, your recognizable language in your solos.
This is, I've often been asked this, and I'm not sure what the answer is. Just as some people, without trying to do so, end up with an unusual and unique kind of speaking style. And other people speak pretty generically. But there are some people among, your friends, among your acquaintances, who you would recognize immediately on the telephone if they spoke 3 words because of the way, the tone, intonation of their voice, and their way of pronouncing things, and that sort of thing. So it seems to me that to some extent it's the luck of, genealogy and chance and whatever else that some people end up with a more unique style and sound. Because there's 2 things. There's the sound on your instrument, and then there's the style that you arrange the notes. And it's, you would think with the vibraphone and the piano that the sound on the instrument would not be that big an issue, but it is. You can, players sound much different, just the way they, handle the keys. Not all piano players, attack the keys the same. And so we even the instruments that are not wind instruments end up having individual sound quality that becomes part of your identity. But the phrasing, the timing, even in written music where everybody's going to play the same notes, no 2 performers play it the same way, even if they play the notes exactly correct. My end about that was listening to Michelangelo, the pianist, who was one of my favorites. I was listening to a Chopin piece at home on the record and loving it. I'm like, oh, it was so inspiring. And I went over to Berkeley, which was 5 minutes away from my house. And as I pulled into the Berkeley parking lot, it was a spring day, and the Boston Conservatory was across the alley, and the windows were open, and there was somebody playing the very same piece. So I thought, this is interesting. So I sat there in the car and listened to this other version. It didn't inspire me at all. It was note for note the same, and yet, miles apart. And yet, I suppose if you could, imprint one on top of the other, you would only see minor differences in volume and, pacing and all that sort of thing. And yet, there was a gigantic difference in the way two different pianists were playing. So I think part of developing your own style is happenstance. You can't say to yourself, okay, starting tomorrow, I'm going to play differently and it's just going to be me. We're made up with all kinds of influences that we've been exposed to, as well as, some aspects of just how we grew up and how we're, how our brain was formed as we were learning to play. Among classical musicians, how do you, as a teacher, explain, the difference between playing this, piece that's been played tens of thousands of times? How do you talk to a student about their interpretation?
I think I agree with you that in many ways, this sort of developing a certain manner, let's not call it style, but manner of one's own is happenstance, and from eclectic, hopefully very rich exposure and some lucky confluence, plus obviously work. But I think, well, last week we had a seminar with a composer who is a classical composer, but also has jazz in his background, Matthew Aucoin, and he made a good point, I thought, and might be interesting to discuss it with you. He said that in classical music, essentially the score, the written down instructions, is the ultimate reference point, whereas in improvised music, it is essentially the performance that is the ultimate reference point.
That's very good. I haven't thought of that, but this leads me to another observation that I've had. Most of the years I was still playing actively, my friends would send me music, and it would be written out. I'm talking Chick Corea, Keith Jarrett, Carla Bley, the composers that were friends of mine, who would send me pieces if they thought it was something that would be appropriate for my band. This is your kind of piece, I think. But all I would know, I wouldn't know tempo or style or interpretation or anything. I would just see the notes on the page. And so I would sit down at the piano because it's more comfortable than standing at the vibes for hours. And I would just play exactly the written notes on the page, the basic chord symbol and the melody, and listen and see what it tells me. And eventually I would find, how the song worked for me. And I might hear later that, wow, Chick plays it a lot faster, or with a whole different, approach. But this is, how the tune connected to me. Some of that went away when technology came along and people started sending me performances of their tunes, which then sort of forced me to hear it, in their interpretation. In fact, they would infuriate me by using the vibraphone sound on the synthesizer as well, kind of suggesting, well, this is probably what you will sound like when you play my song. I said, I don't want to sound like you would want me to sound. I want to find my own way. So I always preferred, the written page that then let my mind make the connection to the music.
Yeah, and of course that makes sense. There is an advantage that you have that Chick Corea, Keith Jarrett, these people were part of your, let's say, musical circle, in the sense that, well, you knew their personalities. Where, of course, as classical musicians, one deals with well, sometimes
Yeah.
luckily very living people, but sometimes very dead people, and
Yeah.
from a long time ago. So we have that archaeological problem as well. But I think a lot of people will ask, and well, a lot of classical musicians ask that. But I think everybody will wonder how technically do you think? I don't mean now in terms of emotions, but how much do you think about the actual technical elements of the musical language when you play? Are you thinking, well, I'll play around with the third, I'll play around with this chord, or because for now you've been talking about telling a story, feeling the character, whatever. Does that's the language that you use for yourself internally, or does this also translate into some very, let's say, um, literally hands-on things in terms of the building blocks of music?
I don't know. It's became such a process for me of just one thing led to another. As I learned the song, I would develop a vision for how I think it should sound and should be interpreted. And I'm always asking myself, what's this song's story? What's it talking about? What's its mood? What's its message? Or what message or mood can I help instill in this song? But for me to be attracted to playing a song in the first place, it usually had to, reach out and grab me to some extent. It couldn't just be,
when you're finally playing a solo, you are not anymore thinking about, so well, a fourth here or that kind of scale there. This is
no, definitely not thinking of any of the components or the technical, what do you like, the compositional elements or anything. I that I got through in the learning, just going, like I say, just learning it in its original form, and then after that, I'm playing on the song, and I stopped thinking about reharmonizations pop up, out of the blue, unexpectedly, and I fall into them. But we have this big storage facility in our memory, that we don't actually know that intimately, but it's there. All the music we've learned, all the pieces we've learned, all the playing we've done, there's bits and pieces, fragments of all this stuff floating around in our memory, and it gets triggered by a progression or a little melody phrase, and something connects with something that you may not even remember playing 20 years ago, and outcome from your imagination comes the next melody phrase. It's like when we talk, you don't know exactly what words you're going to say until just a split second before you speak or as you speak. And sometimes you'll catch yourself if you're about to say something you shouldn't. Sometimes it's too late. You already go ahead and say it. But there's this storehouse of words and phrases and sentences and experiences and so on. And there is a musical version of that's in there. And that's where we draw upon when we're improvising. I'm sure it's what the composer draws on as well. I mean, you can only compose so much by following formulas that I was taught in school. You can do this and this leads to that, and then these harmonies can go in this order. Eventually you need more than just established, tried and true patterns and formulas. And we have this language ability that works for us in speech, but it also is the same thing in improvisation. And it, it's, I'm convinced it's the more I put in to my memory bank, more pieces. I always tell people, learn more pieces. So many young students, they've mastered 4 songs and they think they're ready for their first gig. And I say, no, you're going to need, 15 songs to get through, 3 hours of playing on the gig. And every time you learn a new song, even if it's not a great one, your brain learns some more and adds to your filing cabinet, so to speak.
There's a question that is flowing out of this. Giovanni Bergamini asks, could you name a few solos by you or other musicians that are your favorites in terms of storytelling?
Oh my goodness. Well, let's see. I heard it recently. If you go onto YouTube, there was a little desk concert that I did with Julian Lage, my guitar buddy. And the first song we played was a Phil Wood song called Waltz for a Lovely Wife. I heard it just a week or so ago, and I was really impressed with how well my solo was structured and developed. And I was saying to myself, I really nailed that one. That's a perfect example. So there's one. The trouble is, I don't listen to my records.
For those of you that are Googling furiously, I just posted it. I think.
Oh, okay, cool.
In the chat, so you can check it out later. And
thing is, a lot of musicians don't listen to their records much. For me, by the time I finished a record and mixed it and mastered it and everything else, I had heard it so many hundreds of times that I was pretty much over it. And then once I moved on to new material and so on, I never would really be inspired to go back and listen to them again, unless I was at a radio interview or something and they would play a track from one of my records or something, and oh yeah, I haven't heard that one for a long time. But so I'm afraid I'm not in a good position to identify the perfect solo from my past. But that's the one that caught my ear just recently, because it happened to be about a week ago that I saw that. In fact, I love the fact that YouTube has all these things. I looked at a concert that I did with Stan Getz in London in 1966. It was still black and white TV in those days, and I was 23 years old, something like that, or 24. I was much more adventurous, I think, then than I became later. I was surprised by how much I was doing things that were kind of getting outside the given harmonies and so on. So actually, that'd be another one that somebody you could check out. There was a solo piece that I did. This was so Stan could take a cigarette break. He always had me play a solo piece in the middle of every concert. And you can see him and Steve Swallow standing behind me smoking while I'm playing this piece. It was a song of mine called The Sunset Bell. And it was inspired, in fact, by a Samuel Barber composition, part of his opera Vanessa, that I had just gone to see a couple of years earlier at the Met in New York when I first moved to New York. And it was like an amazing experience. I'd never seen an opera before. And this music was just so wonderful. And I fell in love with this little intermezzo piece that started the second half of the opera. And I used that as an example to make a song out of it. And I'm sure no one would, I'm sure, and I became friends with Barber in the 70s. And I mentioned this to him, so he had me play it for him. He wasn't impressed at all, although he liked one of my other songs. So, go figure. But but I was surprised at how adventurously I played this song on that early telecast in the 1960s. I don't think I would have the nerve to have tried some of those things today.
And there's a question that Miguel Angel Perez Grande asks, well, good afternoon from Madrid. Do you think it's important to work with transcriptions of solos? And that's what I wanted to ask you also. So on one hand, we talked about influences and being eclectic in the influences. How much do you, would you recommend students touching that?
Yes, well, I have very strong feelings about that topic. I was never drawn to copying somebody's solo or learning. I had to, as an assignment at Berkeley when I was a student, I had to copy a big band arrangement by ear, and I also had to copy a solo, like an improvised solo off a record. And I did it for the assignment, but I had no instinct said to me, oh, I got to do some more of this and then learn to play it as well on my instrument. Never occurred to me. And I've always sensed that it would weigh finding your own voice as you went forward as a player. So then I tried an experiment and I started asking the players that I knew that were my contemporaries, Chick, Keith, Steve, Carla, etc. I'd say, by the way, did you ever transcribe some people's solos or anything when you were learning to play? And every one of them said, oh, no, I never did that. And so I said, well, I'm in good company in that case, but I didn't miss anything crucial. So in answer to that question, my personal advice is it's, maybe not that useful or helpful when it comes to building your skills as an improviser, and particularly when it comes to finding your own voice, which will, come along once you get some facility. Then that's the next challenge, is how to find your own way of playing. And transcribing, I think, to me, works against that.
And Tom Sokas asks a follow-up question from other people. Are there some solos that you find particularly memorable that you'd point to from other colleagues, other improvisers?
Well, of course, there were quite a few favorite Bill Evans solos, because his early records were ones that I played many times. His solo on Israel, on the Explorations album, comes to mind. Let's see, there were quite a few Miles Davis ones. Most of his playing on the Sketches of Spain record amazes me, because it's not his usual setting. He's the only soloist, and there's this orchestra all around him, and he's soloing almost the whole time. And yet, it's and it's music he's not familiar with. These are not jazz tunes or jazz harmonies. These are, totally different settings. And he seemed to effortlessly find, how to fit in to the music, to these pieces. So I found them. In fact, I count all the Miles and Gill collaborations. There were like 5 of them, I think, over the years, as 5 of the most important records in the history of jazz. They were both from a compositional standpoint of Gill's writing, and then Miles's ability to find how to be the guy in the spotlight with this music that wasn't what he was used to.
I wanted to ask you about, and it's something that I remember you talking about, and I found that it's it remains something that I think of, and something that's very useful when thinking about discussing musical time, on what one would say, the feel of the music. And you said that when you feel in a band, and I guess solo, that the music is going forward and is sort of starting to slide towards acceleration, that things that are on the beat help sort of stabilize the thing. And when you feel that you want to energize the thing or animate the thing, that offbeat things and syncopated things are the thing that sort of propel it forward. And I wanted to hear you talk about that, and also just generally to hear how you think or how you feel about about time and timing in playing, because I think that's another absolutely striking feature of your music making.
Okay, here's a couple of my observations about time feel. Some people seem to be able to play with comfortable, steady time almost immediately. I think most of us have to learn how to do that. And I certainly struggled with it when I was in high school, teaching myself how to, improvise. And I would occasionally get words of advice from, older, more professional players about, there was a drummer named Shelly Manne who was very popular in jazz in the 50s and 60s. And I met him once, and he told me, he said, stop trying to be the timekeeper when you solo. Let the drummer be in charge of the time, and let him do that. And then you play, with him as the guide. And I always tried to follow that advice, but I really learned it when I started playing with Roy Haynes, about 5 years later. And immediately I said, yes, now I get it. It was so effortless to play with him that I could just forget about time and just float right along with him. So I describe time as being like it's sitting on a fence and it's not stable. It wants to lean and fall off. And if it leans a little bit too much this way, we have to push it back. And if it leans too much this way, we have to push it back. So one side is syncopation, is anticipating. And that, as you said, pushes the time forward, makes it want to feel like it's speeding up. But if you do that too much, it starts to sound edgy and rushy. So we counter that, push it back with on the beat, which settles and centers it and solidifies it. But if we do that too much, it feels like it's stuck in place. So we're going back and forth constantly between accents that are anticipating and accents that are on the beat. This is true for drummers. It's true for compers, like piano players and guitar players and bass players and so on who accompany. We're constantly judging, does the time feel like it needs to settle a little bit now, or does it need to be pushed a little bit now? And we're all making this judgment call as we play the song. And a good rhythm section who gets used to playing together becomes amazingly in tune with the feel of, when it's time to anticipate an attack, or when it's time to play on the beat. And that gives us our time feel. And as I said, my advice, of course, I go back to, is let the drummer be in charge of the time. And often the drummer doesn't realize that he or she is the most important player in the band. You would think maybe it's the piano player or the soloist or something, but if the drummer has a bad night, we all have a bad night. It's one of the sayings that jazz people have. And as the leader of the band, as soon as I finish counting off the song, I lose control. The tempo, the dynamics, the volume levels, the fields, the changes of this, the interpretation of the rise and fall and the shape of the song is going to be controlled by the drummer. So every leader will tell you that they spend twice as much time talking to the drummer as about what they envision for the songs as they do anyone else in the band, because they have so much control over what you can do. I can't do it as the lead instrument. It's not possible in a jazz instrumentation situation. The drums is it. So for me, and for many leaders I know, that's the most important instrument for them. If they find a drummer that they really connect with, they'll try to keep that drummer in the band as long as possible. And because you think the same, you're like a team in a way.
And do you think this is also, so concentrating for a second on a hypothetical drummer, do you think this also, like developing your personal voice, as you were talking about earlier, this is also in some way just something that congeals for some people and doesn't for many or most others? Or are there some strategies, so for somebody to develop better time, let's say in case of the drummer?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the rapport that you have with any other musician is, a chance thing. Just because you like the way someone sounds when you listen to them doesn't necessarily mean that when you actually get to play with them, magic will happen. And in fact, it was a huge shock to me, Bill Evans being one of my big influences and heroes, that when I finally got the chance to play with him a few different occasions, it was awkward. We never did manage to play comfortably together. Twice I sat in with his trio at concerts. We were sharing the bill. We did a record project together that was never released with Stan Getz, that never got past the awkward stage, and I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand, why isn't this working? I know this guy's music, intimately, and yet I never seemed to find a comfortable time feel and kind of thing with him. And yet there are other players that from the first notes we played together, it's like, wow, I totally understand everything that's going on here. So there's, I think there's some of it is chance. There's so many different elements that go into one's style and one's way of interpreting things and playing. And you may have on a scale of 1 to 10, almost any decent professional player would at least be a 4 or a 5, that you can certainly play together and not be embarrassed. But on the other hand, you occasionally find somebody, wow, me, Chick Corea, the first time we played together, it's like 10. Wow, it happened. It was instantaneous. So, you stumble into these, fortunate, connections sometimes, and it's almost an instant, success without having to put in a lot of time to figure out each other. It's like you knew immediately that this is really working.
And so it's in some way a kind of a biological feeling, this feeling of time and feeling time together, seems.
Yeah, I think so. People have often asked me, well, how about you and Chip? You played together for 45 years and you make it seem so easy and everything. How did that happen? And I thought, well, in the most mundane sense, we both grew up in Boston musically. He lived there and I went to school there. We had the same local players as our influences as we were leaving high school and starting our careers. And we both started playing with some of the same people in New York. as we started our careers and so on. And we both came out of the standards and bebop era. So we had a lot of the same mutual, repertoire experience. And yet that's true of me and a lot of other players that, with whom I just play okay with. There was something uniquely special about that particular combination. And even then I thought after some point we'll get tired of doing it. And maybe after a decade or so, we'll go through personal changes and our styles will change and we'll go our different ways. But then after about 25 years together, I finally said, okay, I give up. I think this is going to last. And
last it did. I mean, it's one of the legendary collaborations. It's incredible. But I wanted to ask you, so you said the time, tipping towards one extreme or the other and sort of keeping it in balance, and that the band will feel which way it's going and sort of keep it in balance. Is that usually unified in the sense that, so let's say you would expect that everybody in the band would say, okay, well, we need to stabilize it now, and now it's too steady? Or will sometimes members assume sort of opposing sides, and one pushes to stabilize and one pushes to destabilize? And
some percentage of the time, you're not going to always interpret it the same. So in the course of an entire song, the attacks are going to, sometimes you'll be in synchrony, you'll be synchronized with another player or two, and other times you won't be. But we're all listening to this, trying to keep this groove in the sweet spot, so to speak. And we're following our best instinct as to which way the next attack should come. The next, the comping, as we call it in jazz, is essentially, little rhythmic punches, as opposed to a continuous melodic flow. There are little melody fragments often in comping, but the basis of it is these are rhythmic, taps, and it's when the drummer, breaks away from the right cymbal beat and hits the snare drum on his left hand or the bass drum, and add some accents or the chord instruments. It's when they decide to play the next harmony. Is it going to be a downbeat or an anticipation? We're all just kind of following our instinct and trying to keep that time feel right in that comfortable zone. And we're using the drummer as our rhythm section guide.
And if we talk about, for a second, expanding the scale, if we talk about the structure, or rather the form of the piece, the shape it takes, and very often seems to me it's rather prescribed in jazz that, well, at least there's a danger of the pattern. Well, maybe you have an introduction or you don't, then you play the tune, then this one plays the solo, that one plays the solo, that one plays the solo, maybe the drummer trades some bars, then it plays the tune, the thing is done, maybe there's a coda. Is that, and when I asked this question to Brad Meldau, he said, well, he finds that the fact that it's so prescribed sort of provokes freedom in other aspects. But I wonder, do you feel that this is a blessing, this box in the format, or did you try to fight this rather prescribed route? And if so, how, and what are some of the strategies?
Well, I grew up musically when jazz was very much in a box. Everything was 4/4 syncopated swing. The harmony progressions were almost all based on Broadway show style harmonies, and the soloing was based on the end of the swing era and the bebop era. So the melodic style involved a lot of chromatic, lines and so on. And there was almost no variation in this, and then the arrangements, as you say, tended to be, you play the melody, everybody takes turns soloing, maybe trades some fours with the drummer, and then you play the melody again and it's over. I started my own band in 1967, coming out of Stan Getz's traditional group. And I was looking for finding, a new sound of my own for my new band. And I had fallen in love with the newly arrived rock music of that era, the Beatles. For instance, I was a huge Beatles fan in the mid 60s. And what I liked about them was that they were fearless. They tried all kinds of musical settings. Each piece was like, instead of the whole album being the same kind of instrumentation and the same kind of tunes, which is what a typical jazz record would sound like, it'd be one band following the same format. In the case of the Beatles, the songs were different instruments, different styles. You go from a piece with sitar to something with a string quartet to something else and so on. This freedom really talked to me. So I said, okay, I want to be able to play other kinds of music that are not 4/4 swing and that have different harmony, styles. So I was trying to mix country music, rock music, classical music, and jazz elements into my new band. And the rock elements were the most identifiable to people. The classical music elements, I noticed them, but I think the average public didn't really notice that they were necessarily based on some classical piece I'd heard and tried to turn into a jazz tune. But that was, the era. Then I wasn't the only young jazz musician who was beginning to feel hemmed in by this. There were, at the same time, there were other players who were starting to make records and form bands that were trying different kinds of blending of types of music. And at first, the first reaction we got was, this is heresy. This is not the way jazz is supposed to be played. But that didn't last long. Oddly enough, it was even some of the older traditional jazz players who really, Thelonious Monk, who we played opposite a lot during that first couple of years of my band, he became a big fan of our tunes and the things we were doing. And once you get some of that approval from established players, you think, okay, I don't have to worry about what some reviewer is saying. This seems to be working. And so I'm a big believer in trying not to get trapped in expectations of how it should be. And even in my more recent bands, we had very few pieces where everyone soloed on the same song. This piece would feature Julian on guitar. This one would feature Vadim on piano, or maybe just the two of them and not me, and so on. I wanted to change the colors and shift the personalities of the pieces around, so it never was predictable.
That's fascinating. I have to ask you also, you knew these questions would also come, about the relationship to the instrument. And of course, I think especially colleague percussionists always ask you about your grip of the mallets and the four mallets, but more generally, you I think from instrumentalists in any style, let's say in the last 60 years, I think you have one of the most enviably fluid ways, in the best sense, of interacting with, well, with gravitation and with the universe, and therefore also with your instrument. And it would be interesting to hear you speak about that, about your relationship with the instrument and your physicality. I seem to remember that practicing a lot was not something that you felt you needed to do to feel that you were in shape, which also seems rather unique and quite astounding to a lot of people. So if you could talk about that.
Well, I never was in the habit of regular practicing. You know, a lot of times when you're a child and you start music lessons, your parents say, well, okay, you have to go practice an hour a day or whatever. I had a teacher only when I was 6 years old for about a year and a half that introduced me to the marimba and the vibraphone. But from then on, I just kept playing on my own. And so it was kind of up to me. If I wanted to spend an hour or two playing, I did. If I skipped a day or two, I did. The vibraphone and the marimba, which I did both for the first decade that I was playing, are very forgiving instruments. There's no embouchure involved. There's no complicated fingering techniques or anything that you have to learn. It's an easy instrument to teach yourself, and it's also one that you don't have to keep a constant maintenance of in order to maintain your playing. Even through the years, I would occasionally take a month off or two even sometimes and come back, and within 10 minutes it felt the same. And that's just lucky that I chose the instrument that's very forgiving in that sense. In terms of, with the vibraphone, there were sort of two paths to go. One was you can play in the single line melodic style, like a horn. And the champion of that was and is Milt Jackson during his career. And the other option is to play it like a keyboard instrument, like a piano, which is the direction I went. Partly because I grew up in a small farm town and I didn't have anyone else to play with. And as I started learning jazz tunes, I was in maybe 14, 15 years old. I needed harmony. I wanted the music to sound more complete and fill it in. And so I started playing with 4 mallets clumsily at first, and gradually it got easier than I had expected, and I could play chords as well as solo. And that shaped my concept for the instrument for the rest of my playing years. It was not a common approach to the vibraphone at that point. There had been some xylophone players, Red Norvo, back in the 20s and 30s, who played with 4 mallets. But when I came along, it was kind of an unexplored area, and was a great opportunity for me in a way to kind of make my mark on the instrument and on my entry into the jazz world, because I got to be a pioneer at something, which gave me an earlier start in my career than most people would have had. If I was a piano player, it would have been 5 years later if I had gotten good enough at it, because there were already tons of piano players to compete with. But with the vibraphone, there were few and far between, particularly back in that era. I tried other instruments. I got very nervous about committing myself to the vibraphone for a few years. And at the end of high school and starting Berkeley, I had to be a piano major at school because there was no vibraphone teacher. And it turned out to be a great blessing, because there was wonderful classical piano teacher there who introduced me to easy pieces by Mozart and Debussy and so on. And so it was opened up a whole world of music that I was, unfamiliar with. And I became an okay piano player. In fact, that was the peak of my piano playing ability was after my second year at Berklee, and it was downhill after that because all I ever did following that was, comping along with students later on when I did teaching. But I'm forgetting what my point is that I'm going, got off onto this tangent. I tried other instruments. I got a saxophone, I got a flute, I got a trumpet. I could develop a certain, beginning level mastery of each of these instruments, but it didn't feel like it really, was right. And I ended up, the one I feel really was totally comfortable with is the vibraphone. And I raised this question to Jim Hall, the guitarist. We made a record together when I first was coming to New York, and he came over to my apartment to listen to the tapes before it came out. And I laid this story on him, how I was worried about tying my career to the vibraphone. What if it's not ever a popular instrument? And he laughed and said, it doesn't matter what you play. It just matters how you play. And he gave me a weird piece of advice, which came true years later. He said, there's an accordion. I had even made the comment that what if it was an accordion? I mean, what would my future possibly be in jazz? He said, listen, there's a guy in Argentina that plays an accordion-like instrument that is so amazing. If you heard him, you would have no doubts about the instrument. And his name was Astor Piazzolla. And sure enough, years later, I got to know him and play with him. And he was, one of the most amazing musicians that I came across in my life. But it was Jim Hall told me about him a decade earlier than that. I'd never heard of him. And I asked Jim about it later, and he said he didn't remember ever talking about having that conversation or anything. He said, I didn't realize I knew who Astor Piazzolla was. Really? I said that. I said, yes, you did.
Well, I think there was a question, in fact, from Lucas Dorado about how was it to play with Astor Piazzolla, and I think it would be interesting to ask you. Well, you've had so many incredible partners. You already mentioned a little bit Chick Corea, Keith Jarrett, Stan Getz. I know. I think you told me you didn't play with Miles Davis, but that you had some funny stories with Miles Davis, that you were scared of him, which is an interesting thing to hear you talk about. And then, of course, about Piazzolla, I remember that you, in fact, and now we talk a little bit about the cross-border exchange. I think you had interactions with Samuel Barber and taught him some concepts of improvisation. So let's have you talk a little bit about some of these musicians and partners.
Sure. Well, Astor, for instance, I met him when I was touring with Stan Getz. We played 2 nights opposite his band in Buenos Aires. And I remember Steve Swallow and I both just in awe of his band and his playing. We stood at the side of the stage each night, just amazed at what we were hearing. And I took home a bunch of his records that were only available in Argentina and played them for my friends, I'm sure to the point where, they stopped coming over because I couldn't stop talking about this guy. 20 years later, he walked up to me at a concert in Paris and said, "You remember me?" I said, "Absolutely. How's things going? Would you like to play a project? Would you like to do a project together?" And without thinking, I said yes. And then I worried about it because I never had played tango, and I know he wasn't looking for improvising. He was looking for some kind of tango with a touch of jazz. interpretation involved, and it was going to be all written music and so on. So a year or two went by and I didn't hear from him. And then finally he called and said, I'm ready to start. Do you want to do it? And I said, okay. It turns out we were going to be in the same city a month or so later in Buenos Aires when I was going on a tour, and he was going home for Christmas for the holidays. And we met at a club that we were playing, and he said, I was so excited after our conversation that I've written all the music. I can't wait to show it to you. I said, oh my God, you know, how did you know how to write for the vibraphone? He said, I think I got it okay. I said, you know, there's certain things you can't do because with my 4 sticks, I can't play 3 sticks all in one register and one up here. You know, there's lots of things that you have to watch out for. We had our first rehearsal at a festival in Italy. We were going to play at Ravenna, and as part of a tour that we were going to start. His band had not seen the music either, and we had 2 days set aside to rehearse this whole hour's worth of new music. And we started rehearsing. We did about 2 hours, and he said, well, it's time for lunch. Let's take a break. And we never came back. I mean, lunch went into take a nap, and the next thing you know, that was it. And we finally got through all 6 pieces by the end of the second day, but barely. And then we had to play the concert that night, and we managed to get through it without falling apart. And 4 days later, we recorded it at the Montreux Festival, and it turned out wonderfully. I was amazed at myself as well as him and his musicians. I learned so much from that experience. I was used to improvising a chorus of a song, you know, and maybe several choruses. I'd play a solo that would last 2 minutes, 3 minutes or something. He wanted me to improvise little moments, do something there in that measure, and then go right back to the written part. Add something there, do a little something in that spot. You know, and so I had to learn how to read the music and improvise and go right back to the reading and have it make sense and flow as if it was intentional, but slightly, you know, loose and with variations along the way. And at first that was hard for me to make my mind, you know, adjust to this. But it soon became, you know, something I got comfortable with. And I fell in love with his music, the dynamics, the expression, the drama. It changed my jazz playing. I got much more expressive as a jazz player, I'm convinced, from learning tango with Astor. He was always telling me, yes, more there. Bring more out. Make that a secret when you play that part. He really heard how he wanted it to be and was good at explaining it to me. So that was, you know, one of my great learning experiences. And I have to say, I'm so thrilled that I continued playing his music even after he passed away. I reunited with his musicians for 3 more records and a television concert. As the years went by. So that's my
great records those are. And if I just stay on the subject of tango for a second, what are some of the particular specifics of playing a tango versus that you learned that are different, you know, from say other things and kinds of things that you played?
From jazz, the tempos are very fluid. Tempos change constantly in a typical, not the dance tangos, the traditional, but in Piazzolla's music, the contemporary tango as it's called, there were constant rubato sections, stops, starts, a new slower tempo now, and then a faster tempo in the next section. And someone in the group was always designated as who was going to set the next tempo. It would be whoever's part might be featured in the next section. So, and often it would be Piazzolla himself, the bandoneon, is sort of the timekeeper in the tango band, so they usually don't have a drummer. But if the next section was to feature the violin, as the violinist started, he would set the new tempo for the rest of us to follow, and so on. So I loved this, the fact that the tempos were constantly changing, and it would allow much greater shifts of mood and effect, which I'm sure is true in much of classical music. I remember Sonny Rollins and his band with Jim Hall called The Bridge was their album. He was trying to stopping tempo, slowing down, speeding up, and it was such a radical thing for a jazz quartet to do that I think Sonny had a good idea there, that it would add more dimension, but it didn't catch on. No one else, did it, picked up on it and added it to their range of options. But that was a big thing in the tango music. So,
and something about the basic tango pattern, the metric pattern of the beat, is something that surprised you, or this was more or less how you would read it on the page? Or
well, I had listened to a lot of his records before we began the collaboration, so I had a sense for the feels. And of course, there's more than one tango feel. There's the milonga, which is an older style, and so on. And he would tell me, okay, this one is a such and such. This piece is the other one. To me, they sound pretty similar, so I'm not sure exactly where the line is between them. But each piece that we played had a pretty defined, time interpretation. Some of them did stay in tempo for the whole piece. Most of them didn't. Most of them had time changes. Some of them were in 3/4 time. There were occasional measures that were, like in 5/4 or something. But he always said his tango pieces were not meant for dancing because they didn't follow a steady beat like the club musicians and so on, and the old concert hall musicians that used to play these big ballrooms back when jazz was in its early days. Big bands playing swing. Tango had its own thing going with large tango orchestras playing for dancing in ballrooms. They followed in a very similar time frame. Went from the big ensembles to little small combos, both starting in the 1950s and 60s. So they followed kind of the same time frame, both tango and jazz.
And jumping now from one composer, from Piazzolla to another, to Samuel Barber. And in fact, it's interesting that both were students of Nadia Boulanger. People often overlook the fact that Piazzolla studied with Boulanger, and obviously, of course, so did Barber. But what was your interaction like with Samuel Barber, and what was your observation of him trying to improvise jazz?
Well, what brought us together was the record company came to me and said, it was the fellow in charge of Roger Hall. My God, I just remembered his name. He was in charge of the classical division. And he approached me and said they wanted to explore the idea of combining, a jazz artist on the label with some of their classical artists. And so I said, well, that sounds interesting. Let's keep talking about it. And it came down to the fact that I had a jazz quartet, and they also had the Guarneri string quartet. So we had these two quartets, classical and jazz. And then the next question was, well, we would need music, so there would have to be a composer involved. And so he asked me, did I have any particular composers in mind? And I said, well, I'm not an expert on very many living ones. So I named a couple, including Barber, whose music I had been familiar with. He said, oh, let me call Sam up. And I said, I was kind of almost fell out of my chair that he had, in fact, got in touch with Barber and said, would you be interested in this project? And he knew some of the guys in the Guarneri already. And he was, at that point, had just finished his second opera, the Antony and Cleopatra big opera that christened the new Metropolitan Opera building in Lincoln Center. And he was, between projects, so to speak. So the plan was we would meet and talk about it and see where things went. So it started by him having me, I didn't have the vibraphone with me when we first met. He had a New York apartment and a house in the country. He was in New York at the apartment. He had a piano, so he had me play some sample pieces of things that I played. And then he'd ask me questions about improvising and so on. And then we started this regular pattern of me going up to his house in the country about once a month. And we would spend an afternoon in his music room, talking, playing. He would play the piano, I would play the piano. He would describe how he worked, that he did all his writing standing at an easel instead of. I asked, do you use the piano at all? And he never, if I hear the piano, then I can't picture the separate instruments in the orchestra. So I never played the parts on the piano. And he also said he actually had Rachmaninoff's piano. He said it had taken him, he'd been promised it. And he said it took me 5 years after he died for his widow to finally give it up. But he was proud of having this. It wasn't a big concert grand. It was like a 6 foot, it must have been the piano that he had in his apartment in New York or something. Anyway, this went on for a while. And he finally said to me, okay, I've got to know how this improvisation stuff works. What do you think when you're doing it? How do you know what to play? So I started explaining it. Showing him how we work from the harmonies. In fact, as I recall, I wrote out a 12-bar blues and said, here are the chords. And then we make up our melodies over these harmonies. So he finally said, how about, I want to hear your band. I want to hear the quartet. So the next time I came up, it was a Sunday afternoon, I brought the musicians with me. We brought all our instruments, we set up, and we played a few pieces for him. And then he said, can I try it too? I said, sure. So I gave him, again, some chord changes, and we started playing it. And he did pretty well. He was able to, stick with the right chords and the right notes and so on, but he would tend to lose his place eventually. He would get carried away with the melody that he was developing, and pretty soon he would forget that the harmonies had changed, and he would lose his place in the tune. But we did that for, I don't know, half an hour with him, giving it a try and figuring it out. So he was getting pretty excited about it, and so was I. In retrospect, it would have been probably a nightmare project to try to combine with the Guarneri quartet in my little, amateurish jazz quartet of the day. But I was kind of fearless at that time in my life and didn't realize what I might be getting into. So it finally fell apart because the record company didn't want to offer him much money. to do it. And he said, wow, I said, this is going to be a lot of work. He said, I can't possibly take, you know, several months of time and effort to do all this if it's just going to, if this is all they want to pay. And so it lingered there for a while. And then he finally called up and said, well, I finally decided this, you know, it's not going to happen. But it's been, you know, fun getting to know you. And I enjoyed his company as well. He walked me around his house, showing me things like his Shermer's swimming pool that had been his music publisher all his career. And when they commissioned some piece for their 100th anniversary or 75th anniversary or something, and they said, what do you want for a fee? And he said, well, I've always wanted a swimming pool with lights in it. So they said, consider it done. So he walked me out and showed me this pool very proudly. And he, you know, he was a sweet guy, full of stories, and he loved singers. He came from a family of singers, and liked to write music for singers. I was very happy that I got to record one of his pieces with Makoto Ozone in we made a record of classical pieces that we turned into jazz improvisations. And I found this Barber piece called Excursions, which he said was based on jazz. I couldn't quite make the connection myself to it, but I loved the piece. So, and it worked very nicely for the duo. And still one of my, I actually came across that on YouTube a month or two ago and enjoyed hearing us play it at some concert in Germany. And so that's my Samuel Barber story and history.
I, in fact, remember you playing that project with Makoto. I think I caught the concert in Freiburg, and I remember you telling me, and this struck me, this phrase, where you said you played, I think, one of the Scarlatti sonatas that, you know, you played whatever 32 bars off, and then you improvised on it, and you said, wow, that, you know, that Scarlatti sonata is just so difficult. And I remember saying to you, Gary, that you play things that are 100 times more complex than that particular Scarlatti sonata. And then you said something that I think also in some way outlines the jazz area and the classical area. You said, yes, but in jazz, I never have to play on a given night something I don't feel like I can play. And in some way, if you sign up as a classical instrumentalist, this is so possibly very often the feeling that you're constantly about to play something you don't feel like you can.
Well, it's always terrified me when I have done the occasional classical type of project, and I always say to myself, don't do this again, you know, because it's, you know, it's terrifying. This Greek composer, Thanos Makroutsikos, mostly he did operas, but he invited me to play with the chamber orchestra. He wrote up, you know, an hour's worth of new music, 6 suites, or a suite of 6 parts featuring me. And there was no improvising, it was all written. And I struggled and practiced and learning, and all through the 2 concerts and the recording of it, I was just terrified that I was going to, you know, fail to manage to do this, but managed to, you know, and I would say my performance wasn't exactly perfect. There were parts where, you know, I got off slightly or veered into making up some of my own notes now and then, but he didn't seem to mind. But it's one of the reasons I'm glad I'm in the jazz world. I realize that you must get used to, you know, having to play exactly what's called for night after night. So it must be, at some point, you must be feel as confident in your performing as I would feel in mine. But I always knew in my heart that if I blanked out, it wasn't a big issue. I could keep on going and fix whatever, wasn't quite right. We become, as improvisers, we become great fixers of wrong notes and mistakes and so on. We get to the point where nobody would notice. In fact, Stan Getz was amazing at that. He didn't know much about music. He didn't know chord symbols. He barely read music at all. And he played by ear. So on complicated tunes, he would often hit wrong notes, but he was so used to fixing things that he had a knack for turning any place he, steered wrong, he could, kind of cover it over, and you never noticed. I didn't discover that, he was that he was just playing by ear until we started working together. And I just, wow, he's just listening to the harmonies and kind of playing what he thinks will fit. And he always wanted to learn the more complicated tunes. I would bring in 3 or 4 tunes for him to look at, and here's a nice, easy one for him to follow. And he would pick the one that had, 300 changes and key changes and whatever. He said, no, that's the one I want to do. And then it would take me hours to teach it to him, because I'd have to go over and over it for him to memorize it, by ear. But
so this kind of answers and doesn't answer question from earlier, which I can put in from Clara de Groot, who asked, do you think that having a great knowledge of music theory is indispensable to be able to improvise? So in some way.
Well, these days, I think it is, because the era that Stan came from, it was all the standard tunes with the chord progressions were similar and familiar. And so once you learned them and got used to them, you could handle pretty much anything in that genre. But today's music, covers such a wide range of harmony situations, time situations, everything, that I can't imagine somebody who doesn't read music or doesn't know harmony could manage to keep up. They'd have to stick with the standard familiar kind of repertoire. And there are still some jazz guys that have been around this past few decades who don't read music and play by ear, but they're all doing the same, familiar standard repertoire. That changed with my generation.
And somebody was asking, Joao Semedo was asking, do you think having perfect pitch helped you in the process of not thinking about technical concepts? But I guess one could broaden that question. Do you find that as an important asset in jazz jazz improvising?
Well, this is an interesting topic for me, because I had perfect pitch most of my life, and then I lost it after a major hospital operation. And it's turned out I know a couple other musicians who had surgery and then lost their perfect pitch too. So I'm not the only one that's happened to. That took place in 2011, and suddenly after 50 some years of playing and depending on the fact that every note I heard, I knew what it was. I didn't have to relate it to something else or stop and think, and it didn't hurt my improvising, but it made me feel a little less, in the know about what was going on around me. Used to be, if Chick would land on a chord, I know immediately, oh, he's in the key of E flat and so on. And suddenly, after we resumed playing again and I returned to performing, I noticed he'd hit a chord and I'd start to play and I was wrong. I said, wait a minute, what is that one? And I'd go look at his hands and see, oh gosh, it sounded like an E flat major to me. And in fact, it was a D flat major. And that's when I realized, oh, things have changed. And it didn't, like I say, it didn't stop me from continuing to play for another 5 or 6 years, but I missed it. It was a nice extra thing, and you certainly don't need perfect pitch to become a great improviser. I mean, 90% of the great players in the history of jazz didn't have perfect pitch. So I don't think it's one of those things that you need, but I liked having it, you know. I was sorry it went away.
I understand. And so we covered already, you mentioned some of the legends, Bill Evans. And I remember you telling me stories about Miles Davis and your non-relationship with him. Say, but I think for people here today, this might be an interesting anecdote.
Okay, well, I crossed paths with Miles, you know, a handful of times over the years, either in sharing concert stages or in hotels or whatever. In fact, in one case, I was with Stan Getz in a bar at a hotel in Texas, and Miles was on the same festival. He showed up and sat down, and he and Stan talked right next to me for an hour about their marriage problems and their, you know, whatever, you know, the old days and one thing or another. And I'm sure he didn't even know who I was at that point. I was just happened to be hanging out there with Stan, one of the musicians. But later on, my big situation with Miles was I was interviewed by Leonard Feather, famous jazz writer of the day. He wrote for the Los Angeles Times and Downbeat magazine. And my new band was getting attention because we not only were playing music that involved rock influences, but we also dressed like rock musicians. We had long hair and wild clothes and so on that we had adopted as part of our look. And so in the interview, asked me, explain what this is all about. You know, where are you going with this? So what gave you the idea? What's the concept? And I answered, which I thought was pretty straightforward. I said, well, we're like all young players, we're trying to find our own voice, our own style. And I said, you know, every trumpet player can't play like Miles, and every saxophone player can't play like Coltrane. We have to find our own way of playing. That sounded pretty reasonable to me. Then 2 days later, the newspaper comes out, and the headline of the article was, Burton says Miles and Train are old hat, meaning, you know, no longer relevant. And I was stunned. I said, oh my God, I never would have said such a thing. They're my heroes. And I just said, we don't, you know, we're trying to find our own way of playing it, but I certainly don't disrespect them, of all people. So I called him up and complained, and he said, well, I mean, that's what I thought you meant. I'm sorry if you're unhappy about it, but, you know, that was it. But I said, well, at least it was just a newspaper, and it'll be gone tomorrow. Tomorrow it'll be on the bottom of somebody's bird cage. So, you know, no, forget about it. And then I was a few weeks later playing in San Francisco at a club, and the manager of the club used to be the manager of the Village Vanguard in New York for many years. Lou something or other was his name. And friendly guy, he had hired my band a couple of times to come into this club in San Francisco. And we were playing there, and turned out Miles showed up one day for lunch to reconnect with Lou, his old buddy, and so on. And so Miles said to Lou, so how's it going? What's going on with the club and everything? And Lou said, well, it's going great. We have this band in now. They're really, you know, popular. This Gary Burton group. And he said, Miles got really angry looking, and he said, tell him if he ever mentions my name again, I'll kill him. So that night, Lou called me over and said, what? I told me the story about Miles. He said, well, I don't know what on earth prompted that. I said, oh, I guess I can guess what happened. He saw this article in the LA paper and took it personally. So I said, I don't know what to do. And he said, write him a letter. I said, I know what hotel he's staying at in the city. So write him a note and send it over so he gets it before he leaves town. And just say, you know, it was a mistake. You didn't say anything. You know, it wasn't what you meant to say. And just trying to give a little explanation and apologize. So I did. I have no idea if he got it or what he thought about it after that. But I crossed paths with him at least 10, 12 more times over the years. We would be on the same concert, sharing the stage, you know, and I went out of my way not to confront him or try to talk to him, but then nobody else was trying to talk to him either. To be honest, he was always a scary presence. He wasn't called the Prince of Darkness for nothing. This guy, he liked sort of terrorizing everybody. And so I never knew. He didn't approach me. I'm sure he knew who I was, and on several of those occasions, you know, but he didn't try to talk to me or even give a sign that he recognized me or anything. But that's my Miles story. I always wished I had the chance to play with him once or something. He only, as far as I know, he only played with a vibes player once, and that was a record he made with Milt Jackson back in the 50s. But otherwise, he never had a vibist in his band. I don't know that he had something against the vibes, but he just never had one. And a lot of my friends ended up playing in his band. You know, Shakira, John Schofield, others, you know, passed through his band. Keith also on their path, you know, to their own careers. And also, it was an experience that I would have loved to have had, even though I'm sure I would have been scared to death, you know, during most of the time.
Yeah, understandable. And if I asked you to explain, quote unquote, explain Thelonious Monk, because it seems that there's some people that absolutely adore him, and also, let's say, a certain awkwardness of the actual instrumental playing as the virtue, and then other people seem to be so left out of the adoration club because of exactly that, and the sort of the sparsity of the utterances sometimes. But how should one eat his music making, in your opinion? How do you perceive it?
His great gift was as a composer. His body of work is among the most widely played of any of the jazz composers. And he played a bigger role in the bebop era than he's given credit for, because he was so eccentric in his lifestyle, not showing up for the gigs frequently and that sort of thing. And he wasn't what you would call, you know, a technically facile piano player. You know, he had his own home developed style of playing. And so you had to kind of get used to it. A similar situation to me is the singer Billie Holiday, who never had a typical singer's voice. And yet, once you got used to her plaintive kind of expression and so on, many people became huge lifelong fans of her singing. So Monk had that same thing going with playing the piano, but his longtime legacy are these 60 or so tunes that are so playable and that are so much fun for jazz players to play. And I hardly know of any jazz group that hasn't played some Monk music along the way. And certainly grew up with it, learned from it, and so on. I was lucky to spend quite a bit of time around Monk. it's hard to say you'd spent time in his company because you never knew if he was actually in there or not. Um, he would often say things to us. He became a fan of my band. He liked our tunes, our non-jazz tunes. He would always, wow, that one, wow, but yeah, so and made me feel great that he was so positive about it. But I got to know his musicians well because we ended up sharing the stage at the Village Vanguard as sort of the house band kind of situation for over a couple of year period. Max Gordon booked us in both bands together at least every 3 or 4 months. We would have a week or two together. And then I did a tour of Europe with a bunch of all-star old-timer musicians that Monk was part of. And I was the opening act playing a solo vibraphone set. And then the old all-stars would come out and play a set. That was pretty much the end of Monk's playing career. By that time, he had trouble remembering people and so on. But, and he spent the last almost decade of his life, just living in an apartment, not doing anything because he was under sedation for medication and so on. So his career ended quite a while before his life actually ended. But I felt honored that I got to know him and was just around him, seeing him in person as he played from night to night, and to get encouragement from him as well meant a lot.
Before and eventually, reluctantly, we'll probably have to let you go, but one could just keep asking you questions and have you illuminate all these topics. But I think it would be amiss not to talk about the let's say social placement of jazz and the social acceptance of jazz that I think has really evolved throughout your career, and its acceptance internationally, its acceptance in the, let's say, American cultural life, in the concert halls of the world and of America. And how would you trace that? How would you observe this, the shift that I think has occurred over the decades?
Yeah, I felt very lucky. I've said this once or twice before, that my generation is the one that goes back far enough that we knew the original inventors of jazz personally. I knew Duke Ellington. I saw other players from that first generation of jazz creators in person, in their playing with their bands and so on. And now, we're the last generation that actually goes back far enough to have had in-person connections with that, the jazz pioneers. And I feel that it's a real honor for my group of players and jazz people that, we're sort of this bridge between the beginning of jazz. And I watched over my career the music transition from being a nightclub music and a dance music to entering the concert halls. And of course, it began in the late 30s, the famous Benny Goodman 1938 Carnegie Hall concert, but it didn't really get going more into the concert halls until the 50s. And then by the 60s, the big bands were less important, and small groups were emerging as the big feature, and were the pioneers and the new leaders, and so on. And that, of course, has discontinued. The jazz has now become America's classical music, as they tend to say. It's now held in the same respect that classical music is. I still remember the days when we couldn't play in many concert halls because jazz. This hall was built for classical music, not for jazz. And you can't have microphones in this hall. Sydney Opera House. The first time I played there, they said we'd only allowed microphones starting a year ago, because this was a sacred place, and I ran into that also in Japan. There were no microphones, and in fact, to this day, there are some halls that still refuse to have sound systems. So Makoto and I, or Chick and I, could play them with our duos, but a regular band would not, be accommodated. But mostly now we're considered as accepted and as important culturally. We're one of the few international musics that is, pretty much all over the world. European classical music is all over the world, but jazz is also now. A tango has made somewhat of a move out of just Argentina's, local music to now being pretty international, and mainly due to Piazzolla pioneering it in Europe and Asia. So that's what happened to jazz during my decades in the business. I watched it go from nothing but clubs. When I first toured, gosh, we just went from city to city, a week or two or three or four in each city, playing at a club. That was all. By the time you cross the country, it'd be time to start over, and the occasional concert. And then it shifted more and more toward concerts, and suddenly you find yourself playing at a place that didn't even have a concert hall, but you'd play in the college cafeteria at some small college campus in South Dakota, and so on. And in fact, a booking agent I knew in New York once described, I said, "Where you been playing lately?" I said, "Well, we just did a tour up through the Dakotas and Minnesota and stuff." She says, "Yeah, that's what we in the booking business call Gary Burton territory," because that was when it became okay to book jazz music, when it used to only be okay to book classical. And we owe that to the arrival of rock. Suddenly, instead of jazz being the bad boy music, rock took over that title, and jazz started to look, pretty decent by comparison. So college campuses and cultural arts groups started saying, well, we can branch out now and bring in some jazz. So that transition happened with the arrival of rock in the 60s and 70s, and did a lot to help us, grow culturally in the, in the field. Europe was always better. They were way ahead of the U.S. It's ironic. It's the U.S.'s music supposedly, and yet Europe was by far faster to see how important it was.
Yes, well, we had earlier in the session, Joseph Horowitz was with us, and he's a cultural historian and has written a lot about the snobbery towards jazz, particularly in American classical music circles, whereas in Europe, this was an art form that was so quickly much more admired. But you said international, and I think the question that is obviously in the room, well, often, let's say in classical music, one will hear about, so always is a Russian pianist, so he plays Russian music well, which I think is a very dubious idea. Same thing with, let's say, a German or an Austrian violinist playing Beethoven sonatas. Of course, in jazz, this was really an issue of race, which has always been, for good reasons, a burning point. There's racial relations in America, and obviously you as a white American playing this jazz form that at least originally was predominantly with African American musicians. And that has obviously changed. But I'm sure one encounters this cliche, oh, you know, so is, let's say, German and he plays jazz, or so and so is white and he plays jazz. And of course, thank God that has changed. But what is your view of the situation and of how it really, whether it has any pertinence to the actual music making?
Well, it, of course, you know, you're right, it doesn't. I mean, it may have to do with where you grew up and what you were exposed to when you were learning as a young person, as a new player. But I didn't, you know, my exposure to jazz wasn't based on my growing up in New York City or anything. I grew up in a farm town in rural Indiana, and my exposure to jazz was records I could buy at the record store until I moved to the East Coast to go to school. It can happen. You can get a start anywhere. And definitely there, you know, America is a country very conflicted with race. And, but I'll tell you, I have no history of problems with other musicians, black or white. You know, I never was disrespected by a black musician or treated as that I was not welcome, and so on. It was commentators, people who felt, you know, that it, you know, it should be an issue, but the musicians always respect, you know, the playing. If you can really play, God, you know, join the, you know, come on in, join the band. This was true even in back in the days when people like Benny Goodman would go sit in Harlem at clubs because he could play. He was welcome. It was, you know, it's less and less of an issue. Of course, there are still people who feel like, well, the you know, white players stole the music from the black players and so on. People will form whatever you know, mindsets they might about these kinds of things, but the musicians have never held those kinds of feelings. And I suspect even among, as you say, well, you know, the French players play French music and the Russian play Russian and all that. I suspect that's probably not considered much the, you know, the theory anymore. Because
one hopes so, but I think you make a very good point that the musicians, I think, don't think so, but sometimes people are trying to make this into an issue or into a selling point.
It's the the people who are trying to, you know, put more meaning into things and trying to explain how things happen, often, of course, are way off base, especially now that mobility, at least until the virus arrived, mobility is so great. I mean, you can play anywhere in the world easily, you know, and performers like you know, you've spent, you know, your time, you know, flying all over to all these major parts of the world, playing different kinds of music. I don't think it has much to do with one's roots anymore. And it certainly is less true in jazz than it may have seemed back in the 40s and 50s when groups often were more, you know, segregated. It used to actually be kind of an unusual thing that somebody like Miles would hire a white musician to be in his band. That would have been Bill Evans in the late 1950s, for instance. But
oh, no, headphones.
Well, by this time, you know, that's none of that. That's all ancient history now. And I'm glad I was, you know, I lived through it without, you know, suffering any awkward moments. And I'm, you know, proud to see that jazz has taken its place, you know, in the arts community at a pretty high level. And so as George Wein used to say, art forms never die. And I honestly believe that once you get established at a certain point, um, it may rise and fall in popularity and so on, but it never goes away.
And you feel that the jazz audience and sort of the jazz field, the pool of concerts and the pool of listeners has expanded or stayed steady or is shrinking? What's your non-scientific feel?
It depends on how it's measured. There's been some real upheaval in the business model of music. We used to base everything on selling records. And increasingly, that's not where the music is anymore. Everybody's streaming. And the money is now primarily in live performance fees once it returns, and we can do that. But used to be the big paycheck was for lots of kinds of music was the records would sell, and you'd make a new record every 2 or 3 years, and then live off the money while you organize the next record. That model is changed, and it's changing the way musicians start their careers. Now they start it by posting things on YouTube, and they're not even looking for a record contract. They're looking for getting in front of people and promoting their gigs that they then get as a result. So young players are having to reinvent the model of what it means to be a successful jazz musician, a professional jazz musician. And I give them a lot of credit for originality and entrepreneurship. It was a lot easier in my youth. Once I got signed to a record label, everything fell into place, and it it seemed like I got on the train, and it took me where I was going. And it's a much different ball game now. I'm glad I'm not starting out at this particular time. And I've always been concerned this past year, of course, with the musician friends that I know and still stay in touch with, and how they're managing to wait out this period of no live performances being possible. And I know it will eventually go back to opportunities to play, but it's already the business was in a redesign kind of situation, and we're all trying to kind of feeling our way and figuring out how the future is going to work. But people will still like live music. I'm convinced of that.
Maybe one final question, because I'm really keeping you here for a long time, but I think it would be interesting for people to hear, and not everybody knows that you were really one of the pioneers of online music education. That I remember you started or kick-started Berklee College's online courses as sort of a pilot project in your last years as vice president of the school. And now I think you'll cite better statistics, but it's a very significant part of Berklee's model. And they haven't just started, during the pandemic, like most schools have now and are trying. But what have been some of the, let's say, successes and real blocks to online music education in your experience?
Well, it's brought it. What I noticed most is that it's made a lot of high quality educational opportunities to people all over the world. I mean, when I would travel around touring, local musicians would often tell me, their fondest wish was to go to Berklee if I ever could afford it, or I ever could find the time, and so on. And the online school makes this possible. I taught a course for, I think it was 6 years altogether on improvisation on the online school. And I loved the fact that I had students from India, from China, from Argentina, or Australia, Oklahoma. I mean, it was from anywhere. And I felt it was providing a real service. And many of them were very talented musicians. So whether they would ultimately end up moving to New York and becoming part of the major scene, or just become, the best player in their own country, it was, provided great opportunity. And when we started it in 2001, just as I was, beginning to plan my retirement from Berkeley, it was my last big project, and had no idea it would become as successful and significant as it did become.
Do you know some approximate numbers now of?
Well, I was told that last year, it generated something like $40 million in income. So since the school at this point is not open for on-site students and income, that actually is very helpful to the college to help tide it over until normal classes can resume. But the original hope was that it might eventually break even if we gave it 10 years or so. And it's now been almost 20 years, but it became fairly successful after 5 or 6 years, and then actually became profitable. And I'm sure it's higher in numbers now because people can't come to the school. So even a lot of students probably who would be there in person are taking advantage of taking some courses online while they wait for things to resume. But it was, and I don't want to take anything like sole credit for this. I had a team of people, that were on this with me during, it was, started with me and my main assistant talking about it, just wonder if this would be possible, something that we could do. And then with that opened the door to some experimenting and trying things out, and that kept working. And next thing I know, we said, well, let's, rent some space and set up, a pilot program and get it and see how it works. And it turned out to be good. And I think other schools are now, catching up as well.
I think there's some fear, and I wonder, did you have that fear at Berkeley that this would cannibalize your in-person attendance, or you just plunged into it?
I didn't, because so many of the students that were taking my classes anyway, it was not possible for them to come to the school in person. They were already 35 years old, married, 2 kids, in a job in, somewhere in Australia, whatever. So, it wasn't an option that they could suddenly pick up and move and live for a few years in Boston and go to school. So in fact, it surprised me that there were almost no students in my classes that were actually college age. They tended to be, 30s and 40s, even some 60s and 70s. And occasionally a high school student who wanted to get a sample of what Berkeley might be like if they were to come to it. But I thought there would be a lot of college age students, but no, they actually were going to real music schools, I assumed.
Amazing. Well, in fact, this online possibilities is also what has enabled us to have you as guest today, for which I'm very grateful, and it's just a thrill to see you and to have you talk about about everything, but about the great art form and your amazing path in it. And I'm, of course, very, very grateful for my personal interaction with you starting back in 1993. So
yeah, and it's been great watching you all these years and hearing your concerts that I've managed to get to. Looking forward to the next chance to see you play somewhere.
yes, please stay until then, until we see each other. Please stay healthy, everyone.
Yeah.
Just want to tell you about next week is going to be the final session for this calendar year. Then hopefully everybody can settle into the holiday spirit and make the best out of that this year. And on December 16, it will be a Russian stage director, somebody that has made a real impact in theater and opera, and as well as a nurturer of a young generation of very multifaceted artists. And so the stage director, the person I'm talking about, is Kirill Serebrennikov, a renowned Russian artist. And so I hope to welcome you here. I'm going to post in the chat the link to register to that. And you can sign up for the newsletter and be informed of that session and further ones. But most importantly, thank you to Gary. Please stay healthy and hope to see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.